World Cup fever is riding higher than the soaring temperatures across the planet this summer. So I'm taking another look at hospitality insights from the football pitch and how this interesting mix of sports and travel converge together. Something has been on full display since the World Cup started. It's something that goes beyond football and beyond the headlines and beyond the feel-good viral moments and the heartbreaking near misses. This World Cup has been full of so many plots and subplots, and I'm here for it. I want to take you to a friend of mine who's Croatian, and she was recently sharing a story of an interaction that one of her fellow Croats had when she was asked about the raving, passionate support for the Croatian national team. Listen to what she said in response. She said, "My friend, we didn't receive this as a gift. We paid for it in blood. The best sons of this country gave their lives for these colors. Fathers who never returned to their families, young men who didn't get to achieve their dreams so that we today would have the right to dream ours. That is why this is not just a match to us. This is not just football. It's not just 90 minutes. When Croatia plays, an entire history of pain, defiance, love, and hope plays. That is why a tear comes to our eye when we hear the anthem, because on the pitch, we don't just see 11 players, we see proof that Croatia survived." Beautifully said. I want to talk about the fact that all travel, just like the World Cup, is political. And I want to dig into how this observation has shaped the industry that has made my career and also shaped every one of you listening who works in this industry, who has ever bought a plane ticket, or who has ever chosen one destination over another without really stopping to ask yourself why. I'm Jeremy, and welcome to this week's episode of On Hospitality.
And Hospitality, the #1 podcast in the world.
All right, so back to football. Picture a locker room after a match. The crowd is gone, the game is over, the players are on the bus, and the stadium crew is now in full-up cleaning mode, okay? The locker room smells like sweat and icy hot, and jerseys are all over the floor and the laundry bins. Everything that mattered 90 minutes ago is dissolving into the post-game logistics. And on the wall of a locker room at SoFi Stadium in Inglewood, California, someone has left a note. No, it wasn't the Believe sign from Ted Lasso, which is a great show if you're not watching it, by the way. It was written by the Iranian national football team before they left the building after the match against Belgium. And it said simply this: "From the ancient Persia of 1,000 years ago to the civilized Iran of today, the spirit of Iran remains alive and steadfast. We came to Los Angeles with pride, competed with honor, and leave with dignity. Thank you, Los Angeles, for your hospitality, and thank you to every Iranian who gave their heart, voice, and soul for Iran throughout these 180 minutes. May peace, respect, and friendship prevail among all nations." Now, in the middle of the page, there were two hashtags, 168 and Minab. 168 is a number of people, mostly children and mostly girls, killed in a missile strike on a school in the city of Minab in southern Iran at the start of the conflict with Israel and the United States. A strike that by most accounts was likely launched by the US. The Iranian national football team wrote that note in that locker room, in that country, and left it on the wall. And while the note was eventually picked up by the press and social media, it wasn't written for a press conference, and it wasn't done for the camera. It was written by a team as an act of gratitude for whoever came in to clean up after them. And let's be clear, in the context of the summer of 2026, that note was gently, but decidedly political. Now, something I don't talk about often and don't lead with this, but I have a degree in political science. I graduated back 100 years ago when I studied, and my degree was in political science. Usually when I say that, people brace a little bit. They assume I'm about to say something partisan, or they assume I'm about to say something boring. I'm going to try to do neither of those things today as I talk about this topic. One of the things that studying political science actually taught me, and that has stuck with me long after I forgot the names of the specific theories or the constitutional frameworks, et cetera, is that government might revolve around politics, but politics does not automatically equate to government. Let me say that again. Government revolves around politics, but politics does not automatically equate to government. In fact, sometimes politics has nothing to do with government at all, and it can be two completely different things. I figured that out early, and honestly, the more I studied government, the more I really didn't want to go into it, but I became keenly aware of how politics impacts every aspect of your life. And once you realize that distinction, once you realize that government and politics are not necessarily intertwined automatically, and that politics can exist everywhere else. You start to see it everywhere. It's in every room you walk into. It's in who sits at the head of a dinner table, not just in your family, but in your business. Who sits closest to the kitchen. It's in what information reaches you and what gets filtered out before it does. And it is most definitely in which stories get told about which countries and which stories never get told at all. Let's look at the official definition of politics. It's the art or science of government or governing, especially the governing of a political entity such as a nation and the administration and control of its internal and external affairs. So that's the government part. But now let's take a look at the second meaning of politics. It's the intrigue or maneuvering within a political unit or a group in order to gain control or power. Notice it said nothing about government. It talked about politics as a way of maneuvering around power and trying to establish within a group who's powerful, who has the power and who doesn't. So I'm making the case that politics isn't only what happens in Washington, D.C., or Moscow, or Bogota, or Buenos Aires. It's what happens between people in the negotiation of power and narrative and identity every single day. You're doing politics right now, whether you know it or not. I hear people say all the time, well, I don't do politics. Politics is doing you. And travel is one of the most political acts a human being can perform. I've said it now on this show 100 times, and I'll probably say it another 100 times before I die. Travel is a cure for ignorance, that you don't fix a closed mind by arguing with it. You fix it by putting that closed mind in an unfamiliar room until the unfamiliar becomes human. When you can see the person that you were against, and suddenly they become a human, they have a face. I believe that. But I've been thinking lately about something I don't say enough. The choice to travel somewhere in the first place, and the choice of who we root for when we're watching the World Cup, and who we pick sides with, those choices are never neutral. They never were. Where we go says something about who we think matters. We're voting with our money, we're voting with our feet. Where we refuse to stay also says something too. The hotel chains that build properties in certain countries and not others, that's political. The conferences that choose to relocate away from states that pass certain laws, well, that's political. The traveler who boycotts a destination over its government policies and the traveler who doesn't even think twice about going, well, both are making a political statement in a way. One of them is just making it consciously. The World Cup gave us plots and infinite subplots. It gave us two teams among many, but Iran and Cape Verde that I want to talk about today. The story of those two teams highlight these exact stories where the conscious and subconscious political choices that are constantly at play around us, about the gap between what governments project and what people actually carry in their hearts and minds when they're interacting among each other, about who gets to travel and who gets stopped at the border. It's a big topic this World Cup, and which narrative reaches us through the news cycle and which ones we only find when we really have to go looking. And lucky for you, I went looking. Here's what I found. Let me talk a little bit about what the Iranian team carried into the tournament. And I'm not talking with the suitcases, but in the very fiber of their beings, what they brought. When the squad landed in Mexico at the start of the World Cup, every player stepped off the plane wearing a small gold pin. Just one number, 168. It's the one I referenced earlier. It's the number of people killed in the missile strike on that school I mentioned in the city of Manab. Most of the victims were children. Most of them were girls. It's very uncomfortable to talk about. The strike was likely launched by the United States. These men flew into the country that, by most accounts, killed those children, and they wore the number of the dead on their chest. Instead of a press conference about it or releasing a statement, they just wore it. And they said publicly, we're here for football, not for politics. That was their actual quote. We're here for football, not for politics. But that might be one of the most politically sophisticated or nuanced things said by anyone at this tournament, because definitely politics were at play. We are here for football, not politics. On the surface, it's a deflection. Like, don't talk about politics. We don't want to get in the geopolitical firestorm that we're in right now. But underneath it, the pins are screaming. The notes in the locker room is screaming. At their last training session in Tijuana before traveling to Seattle for their first game, someone had stuck four small flags into the turf, and each one of them had the number 168 on it. They didn't have to do that. No one was watching the training session, but these were very subtle ways to make a very political statement, and they couldn't just hide behind or just football because they were trying to send a message. The politics came with them on the plane, whether they named them or not. And it gets even a little more complicated in the way that real life is always more complicated than the headline. The Iranian diaspora in the United States was divided, actually, about whether to support this team at all. Think about what that means. You left Iran. Your parents left Iran, whatever. You were born and raised in the States, perhaps, but with Iranian descent. but you left because of what the Islamic Republic is and what it represents. You built a life in Los Angeles or New York or wherever, San Diego, it doesn't matter, carrying the weight of a country that you love in a government that you fear. And then the national football team shows up in your city. What do? Do you root for them, or do you see it as an extension of the government? Some people said the team was inseparable from the state and that cheering for them meant in some way you were legitimizing the government that was cracking down on the protesters of the streets of Tehran just months earlier. I mean, they've actually killed like 7,000 people in this crackdown since January of this year. It's a very complicated situation. Others said that was exactly the wrong way to think about it. One fan who drove to San Diego just to see the team off when they left for the airport in Tijuana put it this way: you don't see someone screaming at Christian Pulisic for something Trump does. Christian Pulisic, by the way, is one of the more popular and better U.S. Football players. And he's right. We don't. As a general rule, we don't hold the athletes responsible for the foreign policies of their government. We just don't. And especially not, by the way, when it's a country we're comfortable with. The political logic only kicks in when we've already decided that the country is a quote unquote enemy. And deciding which countries are enemies and which ones we should hate, that's not sport, that's politics. And sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but it's usually someone else's politics, decided in the capital of some city somewhere and spoon fed to us through news cycles and algorithms that have their own priorities, until we start to slowly take it all in and mistake those narratives for our own reality. What the Iranian players did in that locker room and on the training field in Tijuana with the flags and the turf and on the chest of every man who wore that pin on the plane was refuse to let the narrative be the whole story. They said we're human beings who lost children to a missile, and we're going to carry those children with us onto the pitch and into the country that launched it. And we're going to call for peace, and we're going to play football, and then we're going to go home. Now, what does all this have to do with the hospitality industry? I would argue everything. There's this unspoken understanding in the hospitality industry that we pride ourselves on being apolitical, on being like the great equalizer, neutral, like Switzerland. The hotel room is the same for everyone. The table is set the same way for every guest. And that's a comforting story. And it's also bullshit. It's, it's fiction. Every time a convention bureau decides which international delegates to pursue and which ones not, well, that's a political decision. Every time a hotel group expands into a new market or pulls out of another one, that's also a political decision. Every time a destination marketing organization decides which stories to tell and highlight about their destination and which stories to leave on the cutting room floor, well, guess what? That story of representation, that's also a political decision. The industry isn't above politics. It never has been. It just hasn't always been very honest about that. The Iranian team wore their politics on the chest and called it football. One could argue that's also fiction. Just as political as the Visitors Bureau selecting which stories to highlight, the team chose to highlight a story and deliver that message too. Now, they were delivering their message through football, but they were delivering their message nonetheless. Let's take a break from the stress and pressure of war in a very, very difficult, tenuous situation between Iran and the United States. Let's take you to Logan Airport in Boston just before the World Cup started in early June. Think of the International Arrivals Terminal. And if you've ever seen the movie Love Actually, it opens with a beautiful scene where Hugh Grant does his voiceover and he's talking about when he wants to reconnect with the human spirit, he goes to the International Arrivals Terminal because that's where you see the love and the people who are being reunited after some time apart. That's the room that I'm talking about right now. The arrival gate is where people are waiting, holding signs and flowers and ready to reunite with friends and loved ones. And on this particular afternoon, people came with flags, Cape Verdean flags, in fact. Now understand, there are more Cape Verdeans living outside of the islands of Cape Verde than actually inside it. 500,000 or so people live in Cape Verdean Islands, and some 1.5 to 2 million form the diaspora all around the world. And a fun fact about my home state of Rhode Island, by the way, partnered with Massachusetts. Between Massachusetts and Rhode Island, there's almost 100,000 Cape Verdeans living in those two states. In fact, when I was growing up playing soccer or football, some of my buddies on the pitch were from Cape Verde. Now that Cape Verdean soccer team has become so popular, well, I was playing with those guys as a kid back, when I was a kid. So not these same players, of course, by the way. These are a whole different generation of players. But on this day, just before the World Cup in Logan Airport, over 100 Cape Verdean fans had gathered to welcome the national team to the U.S. And this is, by the way, their first World Cup that Cape Verde has ever played in. Someone had brought a whistle. People were singing. There was a professor of Portuguese named Carlos Almeida. He was in the crowd. And he described his country as this. This stood out to me. A transnational country, a country that exists simultaneously on the islands and beyond, a country whose identity is built between departures and returns, between longing and belonging. I mean, that is pure poetry. An identity built between departures and returns, between longing and belonging. I've spent my life in an industry that moves workers and people between places, and I'm not sure I've ever quite heard an immigrant experience described more precisely. It brings to mind a brilliant Cape Verdean song, the singer by the name of Cesaria Evora. She called the name of the song is called Saudade. And if you've never heard it, check it out. It's a beautifully, hauntingly beautiful song. Saudade is a Creole version of the Portuguese word saudade. It's a beautiful word that kind of encapsulates the melancholic longing for something lost, whether that be love or the past or a loved one or even your own islands. And in this song, in the context of the song, she's actually singing to the Cape Verdean diaspora and the complicated way the islands miss them as much as they miss the islands. It's beautiful. Check it out. And what's the story behind Cape Verdeans leaving the islands and going to other places? Well, I'll talk about it in the context of southern New England, which is where I was born and raised. In the 18th and 19th centuries, they came over not as leisure travelers, but they actually came as whalers. Portuguese whaling crews would stop in the Cape Verdean Islands on the way to the sea and then take the Cape Verdean workers, bringing them to southeastern New England, which, by the way, at the time was the epicenter of the whaling industry. New Bedford, Massachusetts, by the 1840s and 50s, was the wealthiest city per capita in the entire United States, little old New Bedford. In New Bedford, there's a whaling museum. And at that whaling museum, it actually has a barrel, a permanent display in the Cape Verdean section, because for generations, the connection between Cape Verdean and New England, well, it ran through those barrels. That was like the Amazon of the day. You put your stuff in barrels and you ship it across the sea back to your family in Cape Verdean and vice versa, bringing goods from the Cape Verdean Islands into New England so the people who had left the islands could remember something from home. So the bottom line is Cape Verdeans have been in the US for generations. And for generations, most of America had no idea that they existed. These are the conscious or subconscious decisions we talk about when I say that politics and travel is political. Darlene Spencer, she's the board president of the Cape Verdean Association in New Bedford, Massachusetts. She said her community is regularly mistaken for Dominican, Puerto Rican, or Indian, and that they're constantly having to clarify and constantly having to explain we're African. We're from the 10 islands off the coast of West Africa. We've been here since before your grandparents were born. And still, until this summer, most people had never heard of them. And why do we hear about them this summer? Well, the World Cup. This is the first crack of light in this identity of invisibility. The political dimensions of Cape Verde's story in this tournament are not subtle if you know where to look. As I mentioned in last week's episode, Cape Verde was a Portuguese colony until 1975, so they've only had their independence for 51 years. Its citizens face visa bonds up to $15,000 to enter the U.S. for this tournament, a policy only partially walked back weeks before the kickoff, which was really too late for most of the fans had already given up the idea of going to the trip. And then Woshinya, the keeper that I mentioned last week, stepped onto the field in Atlanta and held Spain to 0 goals. And guess what? That performance alone shot up his Instagram feed from 50,000 followers to 2 million by the end of the day. Visibility is political. Who gets to be seen? Whose story gets told? That's not a neutral outcome. It's a result of systems and structures and decisions made by people with power over a narrative. In this case, obviously, the World Cup has a massive bullhorn to be able to present teams and nations. But the Cape Verde in New Bedford has been there for like 200 years. And it took a 40-year-old goalkeeper making 7 saves against a reigning European champions for America to even notice. Now, in my hometown of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, there's actually a Cape Verdean museum. And the executive director, Joe DeMora, he said something about this that I want you to kind of think about and take in. He said that before the World Cup, the first question he always had to answer when teaching Cape Verdean history and culture was, what is Cape Verde? He had to establish the basic existence of these islands before he could even get to anything else. Well, it's safe to say after this tournament, he can skip that question. We can go deeper now. We can actually teach you the history without having to spend the time about raising consciousness just about what is Cape Verde, right? I get it. It's a big world. There's a lot out there. But think about what it means to spend your entire life having to establish the existence of your very people before you can even get to the substance of who they are and what they represent to the world. And think about what that means for an industry that trades in places and identity. Hotels market destinations, airlines sell routes, convention bureaus pitch cities, But who decides which places are viable destinations? Which countries exist enough in the public imagination to warrant a direct flight, a marketing campaign, a breakout session at an industry conference? I mean, those decisions are not made by the market alone. They're shaped by the same political and media systems that kept Cape Verde invisible for centuries and made it famous in 90 minutes. We are all in this industry in the business of deciding which places matter. And this summer handed us a question we should be asking ourselves more honestly. Why did we decide some of them didn't matter? This isn't a call to action, and I'm not asking you which side of the aisle you fall when it comes time to cast a ballot. What I am asking you to consider is the very complex machinery at play behind the scenes with each travel decision that you make. The demographics of travel are changing. The demographics of who has buying power and who takes meetings and who books room blocks for conventions and conferences. All of this is changing. And if the industry doesn't start reckoning with this, these political dimensions of who this industry has historically been built for and who it has historically overlooked, it's going to find itself surprised by a world that's starting to move on. So let's go back to the locker room. The Iranian team is out of the World Cup and has gone home now. They're back to Iran. They left Tijuana on last Tuesday, and they're heading back to a homeland that's still in the middle of a war. Those players who wore the gold pins, they're private citizens who play football for a living. They did not choose the actions of their government that sent them. They chose to represent the children who lost their lives. They chose gratitude in a handwritten note. Those were political decisions that were very subtle, but very, very noticeable. And as a little interesting side note about how politics collide with geography and sports and travel, when they were watching the final game stage results from a hotel lobby in Tijuana, they needed help from other teams in order to advance out of the beginning stage, the opening stage, or the group stage, or whatever, into the knockout stage. They erupted in cheers when Algeria took the lead in stoppage time. And for just a brief moment, a group of Iranian football players in a Mexican hotel lobby were cheering for a North African nation whose base camp in Lawrence, Kansas, had produced a giant flag mowed into the grass of the university field. Football. I mean, the most political game in the world, right? Cape Verde is really one of the feel-good stories of this entire tournament. They went on to have a hell of a tournament, and they played one of the all-time great games against the reigning World Cup champions, Argentina. That game will go into the history books and live on in the public's imagination for a very long time. They lost that game, but they played so valiantly that they won the hearts of the world. Wozinha has gone from 50,000 Instagrams now. He's up to 20 million, by the way. The woman in New Bedford who had to answer the question, what is Cape Verde? Well, she's not going to have to answer that question much anymore. A museum director in Pawtucket can skip the first chapter of Yes, We Exist and go straight into the history. So let me bring this home. I've spent most of my life in hospitality, and through it all, I've been doing what our industry trains us to do. I focus on the execution, the room block, the F&B minimum, the room nights, the contract, the guest experience delivered at a level that makes the client want to come back. And I believe in that work. I really do. I still do it every single day. But I came up in a discipline, political science, that taught me something the hospitality industry doesn't always want to hear. There is no neutral space. Every environment is a designed environment, and every design is an argument about who matters and who doesn't. The hotel lobby that makes a Western business traveler feel immediately at ease and makes someone else feel immediately watched, is that an accident? Or is it a political outcome of decisions that were made behind the scenes? The convention that draws its entire speaker roster from the same three countries and calls itself international, that's also a political outcome. The destination that spends marketing budgets chasing one demographic and wonders why other demographics don't show up, well, that's a political outcome. I want to be clear. I'm not telling you have to have opinions about Iranian government or Cape Verdean's colonial history before you can do your job. You don't. Nor am I saying that you have to be all things to all people. That's impossible. What I am saying is those news stories we may overlook in the weekly news cycle, well, they aren't separate from our industry. They are the human texture of the people that we're supposed to be serving. What I'm suggesting is we remain curious about them, that we ask questions, and we become aware of how politics often frames the systems that are imperceptibly in motion at all times. Travel reveals the gap between the story a government tells us about people around the world and the story that people themselves carry. That's what happened in the SoFi Stadium locker room. That's what happened in Logan Airport. People showed up. What the Iranian team was really saying was this: we're here as human beings, not as a government, not as a headline, not as whatever story you've already decided to tell about us. That's the same ask that every traveler makes of every destination, whether they say it out loud or not. See me as I am, not as a headline you read about my country or about where I came from. Our industry gets to answer this ask and respond every single day. So I repeat, the question isn't whether travel is political. It's always been political. The question is whether you're making the political choices in your business consciously or whether you're letting someone else's narrative make them for you. Are you aware of the framing that your destination, that your hotel, that your country has put as the guardrails? Just be aware of them. Studying political science didn't make me want to go into government, but it did make me aware that there's always a story at play behind the scenes in every destination I visit, every room I walk into. It's made me more aware of who this is built for, by whom, and whose story is or is not being told here. I've been asking those questions in hotel lobbies and convention centers and airport terminals all my life. And this World Cup just reminded me of why it matters. I said it last week and I'll say it again. Let's big bigger tables, not higher walls, guys. That's a wrap on this week's episode of On Hospitality. I'm genuinely thankful for you listening along. We are the #1 podcast in the world. And if you like this, pass it along to a friend. Be sure to follow, like, make a comment. I'd love to hear from you guys. And until the next time, safe travels.